Yeah, thanks so much for having me. All right, well, I don't really have to do too much of an introduction, just for everyone that's joined the Zoom session here. Everyone who's seen the recording afterwards will know this will be about like an hour 15 of a talk. Afterwards, there's time for like questions overall. If you have any urgent questions, such as about like special words or some kind of words or terms that I'm using that you don't understand, totally fine. Just feel free to either throw something into the chat. If I don't see that, please make me aware of it, or unmute yourself and just interrupt me. Perfectly fine with that. Let's get started. Introduction not really necessary at this point anymore, just so you know a little bit more about what I do as the publishing director at Those Awesome Guys. We're a small Romanian developer / publishing hybrid, a little bit of both. Started as a developer and now we're doing also publishing, but still making games ourselves. I typically handle everything on the business development side, sales and distribution, and I'm one of two people that is sort of at the forefront when it comes to looking at incoming pitch decks or pitches overall, reviewing them, and then figuring out if they're a fit for us, if we're going to move this forward into like a bigger conversation or not. So in the past 2 years, I've seen plenty of pitch decks. Luckily at this point, we're now two people, with my colleague Frank taking over a lot of that responsibility, because it is a lot of work. But yeah, that's basically where I am at right now. Prior to all of this, I used to work in events. On the right side here, you can see a couple of events that I was involved with in any shape or form, anywhere from like full-time work to contract stuff here and there to helping out for specific elements of them. And now you know enough about me. Let's move on. Quick note, or 3 things I want to clarify from the get-go about pitching to publishers. One, there's plenty of different things out there, different companies out there that you may or may not want to pitch at different forms, not only publishers, investors, platform holders, government funding organizations, publishers, of course. This is coming from a publishing perspective. Every pitch may be a little bit different. So yeah, this is going to be about publisher pitchers. If you have any questions about other pitches, like approaching the platform holder or talking to government grants overall, more than happy to talk about that as well. But please keep this in mind. This is not like a universal how to pitch everyone kind of approach. Second, there's plenty of choices out there. Publishers aren't always the right thing for you, and that's coming from me as a publisher. We can talk about that again a little bit later as well if you're interested about what other opportunities are out there. But keep in mind, you don't always have to go with a publisher. No matter if you need the money or the services or both, there are alternatives that might be a better fit for you that you may want to consider. And then thirdly, I'm going to use some concrete pitch deck examples in this presentation a little bit later. I either got permission from the developers to use them, or they were publicly available. Don't have an affiliation with most of the projects. Just want to make sure that I'm not taking credit for something that I didn't actually create myself, and that's clear from the beginning on. So let's get started with who to pitch. General important question when even considering sort of the 3 or 4 step program of deciding you want to pitch someone to actually start a negotiation potentially. What you want to look at is the marketplace overall. Getting an idea of the market is pretty typical, pretty standard, pretty important. I would just suggest sitting down, getting yourself a Google sheet or an Excel sheet and just starting to research. There's no black magic behind it. It's a pretty straightforward process of investing time into understanding who's out there, who may be a valuable candidate for you. And there's a couple of resources that you can take into consideration. Not going to tell you exactly who you should pitch, because that's impossible. Everyone, depending on their needs, their team philosophy overall, and their game that they're pitching, may be looking out for something else. But what I can do is point at a couple of resources. Number one is the portfolio matchup. Pretty straightforward. Spend time learning what other publishers are looking for, what they are publishing already. Doesn't necessarily mean that if a publisher such as Devolver has, now we're just making up examples, but has only released pixel art bloody gore shooters, that they will only be pitching that type of game. But at the same time, you will want to figure out a way where your title might not be exactly the same as something that a publisher has already signed and put out there, but also not be entirely different from the entire scale of titles that they've been releasing or are planning on releasing. The reason for that being brand building, as one of many examples. A publisher, typically one of their responsibilities is to build up a brand around themselves. That's one of the things that you can potentially profit off of, because there's already a community out there. And if they are sort of like publishing a little bit of everything, then there's really not that much of a brand, especially if you go like cross-platform. A typical publisher, I would say in like 2020 in the indie space, usually is focused on platforms. So you have the differentiation between mobile publishers, maybe VR publishers, although that's a very niche market, and then obviously like your console PC publishers. But then again, there's a differentiation between premium and free to play. Many different elements that come into factor. So go on Steam, go on Xbox, go on whatever platform you're using, and just scroll through the list of publishers, or go through your favorite titles and figure out, hey, who actually was involved in that game. There's plenty of tools to also really do intense market research. I can link to those after the presentation or put them on Twitter or something. Just hit me up. Industry credibility is another big thing. That doesn't only mean what people think of you, but sort of like goes hand in hand with the brand building aspect. Go through blog posts, interviews, panels, check out if publishers have been recognized as being like a good partner overall by the industry. I know that the UK games industry, for example, UKIE every year gives an award out to like the best publisher of the year. So does the Deutsche Computerspielpreis and the Deutsche Entwicklerpreis here in Germany. So those may be already some good recognizable awards that will at least paint a picture of what you can imagine a publisher to be like. If they're pure evil and everyone knows about them, chances are they're probably not going to get those awards. And in Twitter threads, quite honestly, there's an incredible amount of data available on Twitter, which is ridiculous. It's a social media network, but it just so happened to establish itself as sort of like the games industry's go-to place for social networking online. And there's a lot of good insight being shared there. Obviously, it takes some time to sort of figure out who you want to follow, who is sharing regular good insight, but just starting somewhere and being part of that platform and engaging with people can go a long way. Number 3 is the distribution success. A little bit goes hand in hand with what I said before, being able to secure partnerships that you might be interested in. So if you have a mobile game and you know, I'm going for the premium market, premium on mobile tends to be a little bit more tricky than it may have been a couple years ago with the establishment of like free to play and now Apple Arcade and the Google Play, I think it's called Google Play Pass, if I hope I'm not mixing that one up. Either way, if you're publishing a premium game on mobile, might as well pitch it to Apple Arcade or might as well pitch it to a couple of other services out there. So if you have a publisher such as Devolver that has already signed a couple of titles with Apple Arcade, you know there's a pre-existing relationship and they at least may be a partner that can help you out with that. Same thing goes for Xbox Game Pass, where No More Robots, Mike Rose and his team have a fantastic relationship, obviously, because they keep on bringing their titles to Game Pass on PC, Android, and console. Yeah, so much about that. Online engagement, another thing, again, active brand recognition, large engagement usually is like has some positive consequences that come with that. There's really good initiatives out there like Pitch Your Game or just a Screenshot Saturday where you can just scout around and figure out what kind of publishers are out there that are actually engaging online with their community or with other developers, and just seek out who is out there, basically. Doesn't have to be too much work. Pitch Your Game this year was, I think, every other month. It's basically like a Twitter hashtag that was happening for, I think, like 12 to 18 hours where people were pitching their game and then under the Pitch Your Game hashtag, and we're getting a bunch of feedback by typically publishers or also or other industry veterans. So keep that in mind. The Ya in Pitch Your Game is YA, just to clarify that. Developer feedback is, I think, something super crucial that everyone should consider when reaching out to publishers, or actually prior to reaching out to publishers. Talk to developers that previously worked with the publishers. They will probably be the best resource for honest and typically pretty transparent feedback. Yes, there's NDAs in place. We all know that NDAs go a long way, and if you sign a contract or an NDA, you should respect those and you shouldn't go against your contract. But people talk to each other, and sometimes it just so happens that within like a friendly environment, they will share whatever they can in a helpful manner to make your decision a little bit easier about approaching a certain publisher. Like if someone was about to talk with us about negotiating a contract, I'm pretty certain, or I'm expecting them to talk to the beautiful glitch team behind Monster Prom, which is like the first game that we published, as an example. And if a publisher is trying to actively like prevent you from talking to their developers, that might be a pretty bad sign. There's really not a concrete reason why that should happen. Oftentimes publishers also offer to just get you connected with their developers because people want to be transparent. And then finally, events. Meet to Match, Pine, and all the other meeting systems out there, they have really good ways of just filtering through all the participants and getting or extracting you a list of all the publishers participating in. I typically do that just out of curiosity, not only to see like what kind of competitors are out there, but also to learn about new companies that I may have not heard about. Publishers are popping up left and right every other day. There's a lot of us, hundreds, if not thousands in this industry at this point that consider themselves publishers. And getting a full overview of that can be tricky, to be fair. So checking out Meet to Match, one of the bigger events, maybe Gamescom or GDC or whatever else might be coming up in 2021, and getting that list plus short descriptions of what the publishers are looking for is typically quite easy through these systems. Now, on the opposite side of the scale, mass email lists, pretty horrible in most cases. I know many people like to advertise like their services as a service provider of, and we have this list of 3,000 publishers. That won't help you out. It's good to get an overview, I guess, like as a starting point, but as the only resource, it's typically pretty useless in comparison to actually spending the time to establish your own little list. I don't recommend not checking out those lists. I'm just saying don't fully rely on those as your only resource. One thing that I've found also quite recently as like a new trend for some reason is competitions that promise the winner a publishing agreement by publisher XYZ. I find that personally highly doubtful to be helpful. A publishing relationship shouldn't be a competition. On the one side, typically, of course, the developer still has the right to say no, which is, otherwise that would be a very bad deal. But on the other side of the spectrum, you want a publisher that's interested in you because of your game, not because of you winning some sort of award. So I would also typically refrain from those. There may be exceptions. So far, I've not seen any. But yeah, competitions overall as leading to a publisher agreement, pretty odd. And then on the maybe list, finally, there's agencies. If funding is available, sure. If you have that to spend on an agency or are comfortable with giving them like a percentage of what kind of deal they secure, might be a viable candidate. Make sure that you're talking to agencies that actually have a track record and can show you, hey, these are the types of partners that we worked with or the types of deals that we secured. Usually it's better to use agencies if you're pitching the bigger guys, like if you're going to EA to pitch them for their EA, I think it's called Originals Initiative, where they had like A Way Out and Faye and Sea of Solitude in there over the last couple of years. Then yeah, a agency can be quite helpful. If you're talking to a small little indie publisher and you actually want to have that relationship between you and them, I would preferably go or take care of pitching myself, or at least hiring someone to be internal rather than handling things through an agency. Getting advice is perfectly fine, but you want that personal connection. And then, yeah, events we already talked about. I may have added it twice here, but what I can recommend strongly is gameconfguide.com. Super good resource that lists like all the events that are happening, at least all the ones that they're aware of, which are typically most of them. What I'm trying to highlight here is this initial process shouldn't really be the problem. There's many resources out there to just get a list. What we'll get to in a second is the filtering process, which is way more important and probably a little bit more tricky for you to figure out. Literally go through the platforms, through Steam, and see who's publishing your favorite game and add them to the list, or similar games. Market research is important, and competitor analysis is important, and figuring out what partner might have already some experience in the genre that you're putting out there. You want to make sure that the publisher can market the game, sell your game, or even get you the deal you want, as I mentioned with like Apple Arcade as an example. So if you had a really hardcore fighting game, you'd probably not come to us because that's not our expertise. All right, filtering. Here's the interesting part. After all this, establishing spreadsheets or Excel sheets, you will end up with ideally a list of a couple dozen, if not a couple hundred of publishers. I'd say the less the better, or the more focused the better, but of course, like, this is just the initial step. As I'd mentioned, you will want to focus on figuring out who is actually working within the platforms that you're publishing to, or that you want your game to be published onto: PC and console, mobile, browser, VR. You probably wouldn't pitch Microsoft a VR title in the same way that you would probably not pitch us a mobile title. And that's a really easy knockout to be removed from the list. Surprisingly enough, we get quite a good amount of mobile and VR pitches every once in a while. That just tells me that the other party has done absolutely no research, and well, it won't have any consequences, obviously, but it's just not, it's a waste of your time, is what I'm trying to say. Financing model. Premium or free-to-play game. There's also like hybrids in between. If you're going for a premium title, you'll have plenty of small to large publishers out there. If you go for a free-to-play game, typically those publishers tend to be a little bit bigger and maybe more focused on like PC and mobile, I would say. But yeah, the bigger your project, the easier it is also to differentiate here between partners. Regions is another one that's getting more and more important, because back in the day we had the international publishers that were taking care of everything, but also neglecting some regions. These days, you have your publishers that are focusing on Latin America, that are China focused only, or just the Western Hemisphere, or African publishers. Everyone is trying to figure out what their market is, what their capabilities are, and not necessarily just sign a deal because they want someone to cover all the regions. But we've seen more and more that indie publishers approach us as well and say, hey, we already have secured someone to take care of the Chinese publishing, so those rights are gone. Do you want to work with us on the rest of the world, basically? And that's something that I see more and more partners also being, or publishers also being open to. So don't be afraid to really consider what your options are out there, and maybe even sign multiple deals, sort of differentiating the different markets so everyone's taking care of their expertise. Same goes for like Russian distributors, or CIS countries typically are like grouped together. So if someone mentions they cover everything, just make sure that they're not only sort of outsourcing the work to another publisher that you could be working with directly. Portfolio match, had briefly talked about that already. I have an example here that I want to just focus on very, very briefly. Chucklefish, Devolver, and Fellow Traveler. 3 pretty big indie publishers in the game, I would say. It's hard, obviously, to summarize what they stand for directly, but I'm going to try to anyways in like very short keywords. I hope I'm not pissing anyone off. So, Chucklefish, overly simplified, oftentimes turn-based games action, as you can see with like word groove or pathway, and pixel art. So 2 keywords I'm going to assign to Chucklefish. Devolver, again pixel art, blood, and action. And then Fellow Traveler, you have narrative-driven titles and unique art styles that are typically a little bit, well, yeah, unique, stand out from the crowd. So if you're left with a project like Pester Quest, which is a visual novel in the Homestuck universe, a quite big IP within like the world of the internet, you'll probably be left pitching Fellow Traveler because they're a narrative publisher. That's what they focus on. That's what they're really experienced and good at. In the same way that a Starbound would probably be pitched to Chucklefish, and a Enter the Gungeon, or is it Exit the Gungeon in this case, would be pitched to Devolver. Again, very simplified. Doesn't mean that you have to pitch these parties. You can always go a little bit outside of like their typical project field. This might be a little bit, or very on the nose, but a publisher with more varied portfolios sometimes can also be a red flag. I'd mentioned previously the brand building aspect. If you think about something like a 4X game, you're working in a 4X game and you want to reach that market. A publisher has put out one 4X game next to a visual novel and then a multiplayer party game, has probably a more differentiated target audience and isn't as specified on just 4X as a genre. Whereas if you're looking for, and just to clarify, 4X standing for Explore, Expand, Exploit, and Exterminate, you're probably going to end up pitching Paradox Interactive, the 4X publisher out there, I would claim. Now, funding capabilities. This is a big one that's oftentimes underestimated and not really taken into consideration. Many different publishers have many different funding ranges, and Electronic Arts might be able to fund your indie-ish title up to a couple $1 million, whereas us as a small indie publisher can do maybe a couple $100,000. And there's publishers out there that do not fund game development. They will, for example, take care of porting or just all the other services, but not fund you game development directly. So figure out what publishers or what kind of financial capabilities they have available, and decide based on that who you may want to pitch. Services as like a final point here, localization, QA, porting is something that generally everybody should be capable of doing. Obviously, oftentimes external, and that's fine. It's just important that they have the pipeline in place to take care of all of this. But yeah, if it's just services that you're looking for, then you might as well sign with anyone or take care of that yourself, because finding a good localization company, QA company, porting company is work, but doable. Here's just a couple of specializations that I tried to narrow down. If you're looking for some focus points in general, or a publisher that's very good in certain fields, then take a look exactly at what a publisher might be really good at, what their focus points might be, and what kind of other entities might be under the same umbrella. A good example is Fellow Traveler, that also has a PR agency that's based out of and focused exclusively on Australia and New Zealand. So if for some reason that's a big market for you, might want to talk to Fellow Traveler. In the same way that for third-party porting, I know one of the publishers that I know that's fantastic at that and very good at turning around quickly, especially with Unity, is the Quantum Astrophysicists Guild out of Seattle. And then Devolver has probably some of the coolest event booths that I've ever seen at like PAXs and not sure if they're at GEC typically on the show floor, but at least at PAX. So if events are a big thing for you and you really want to have that amazing booth, maybe talk to Devolver. That being said, this shouldn't be your key indicator or your only indicator. It's just like a little thing to keep in mind when you're trying to select your favorite publisher that you may want to work with. Personal vibe is final thing here on my list. There's two things here. One, the behind the scenes personal vibe, basically your relationship with the other team. Some people are looking for just a very clear business relationship, not necessarily suit and tie, but business relationship rather than like a close developer friendship, for example. At the end of the day, this is still a business, so keep that in mind. You're not going to sign a deal with someone as a favor because you're friends or something like that. You should sign a deal because of the business behind the idea, but you can still have a personal vibe or a personal relationship with the team that you're working with. And you want to figure out if they're sort of on the same page with you, if they have the similar approaches, similar maybe cultural or social or even political stances. Might be a little bit tricky if you're very left as I am, and then you're working with like a pro-Trump party as a wild example. So yeah, that's one of the key factors that I think people should pay attention to. And if they have the opportunity, the in-person events are typically a very good way of figuring that out. Although for 2021, I'm still a little bit skeptical if we'll have that back. Maybe 2022. Marketing, branding is the other side of things. We already talked about that. The public vibe, basically, that the audience and the industry takes away from that publisher. If there is some bad blood between the publisher and the rest of the industry, might not really be the vibe that you want to get in bed with. All right, and then after you've filtered everything out, just toss back in your inspirations, even if they're not necessarily 100% fit for what you're pitching. Reason for that being, a Devolver, I probably typically wouldn't have pitched a VR mobile game. Now, if you look at their portfolio, they've put out a couple mobile games more in recent times, and they've put out Gorn as a big or major VR title, I would claim at this point, quite successful in terms of VR hardware. So there's always chances or opportunities where at the right time, there might be something opening up at that point. An example, a made-up example that I'm just trying to underline my point here. Back when Devolver was probably talking to Apple Arcade about that upcoming service, and they signed some projects with them, probably got approached with, hey, we're looking for some mobile games for our new service. Do you have something in your portfolio? And if you are pitching a super interesting mobile game that Devolver may have turned away at that point or previously to that, within the time frame of the Apple Arcade conversation coming up, you might have just hit the nail on its head and struck a good deal just by being at the right point at the right time. So yeah, it might sometimes be a little bit far-fetched to pitch someone a project that's outside of their range, but if it's like your one big inspiration or a publisher that you look up to, might as well give it a shot. Worst case, you get a no. After all of this, the hundreds of options probably have been narrowed down to hopefully like a dozen options, or maybe a couple dozen options, but at least something manageable. The reason why you shouldn't just pitch Devolver or Paradox because they're the big names is everyone is doing that. Diversify who you're reaching out to. Not everyone's going to be ending up with the big indie name publisher out there, and they might not always be the right fit for you. To put things into perspective, like we as a publisher are going to have reviewed about 700 titles at the end of this year throughout all of 2020, and we're a tiny publisher in comparison to many big players out there. I can't even imagine how many games Raw Fury or Devolver have been pitched this year that they had to turn down. So yeah, keep that in mind. Make sure you also focus, or that you also take into consideration which smaller guys might be helpful to your business. Where to find this information? A couple of resources. Submission forms on websites. That's something that's getting more and more common. I believe Raw Fury has one on their website. Team 17 has one on their website. Indie Fund is not a publisher, but a fund has like a submission form on their website that clearly states what kind of information they're looking for. And then there's blog posts, FAQs, tiny build, as you can see here, how to pitch your indie game. Just go on the website, look around a little bit. Typically, if something like this is available, it's quite easy to find. And these are just 3 out of many examples that I could find. Where to find this information? Part 2, basically. Interviews. Gamasutra or gamesindustry.biz typically have a bunch of publisher interviews as well throughout the year, not only focused on just general topics from the industry, but who they are, what they do, some highlights, etc. Talks can be super helpful. This talk by Callum from Reboot 2018, back when he was still with Raw Fury, was quite helpful to get an understanding of what he was looking for, and I'll be referencing this talk a couple more times today. Twitter, as mentioned, but again, talking to developers and exchanging information. People in this industry are typically quite friendly. I would state that about 95% of the people in this industry are here because they enjoy working in games. No one is here to get rich. Otherwise, they're quite unrealistic about what this industry can offer to them, unfortunately. But yeah, we want to help each other out. We want to make this industry a better place. So talk to each other and exchange some information. And then finally, generic emails are typically fine. This is again the slide from Callum from back in the day. But ideally, you want to have a contact or reach out to the scouts, whose main responsibility will be to check out your project. Not everyone has a scout, so oftentimes you'll just be referred back to a generic email address that you can send out your pitch to, and then you'll hear back hopefully at some point eventually. But a scout, typically, their responsibility is to either part or full-time look out for projects, find new content, and sign it to the company, or at least bring it to the company to then be signed. Their main responsibility is to check out your game and figure out if it's a fit for them. So if you have a foot in the door with them and know them and can approach them directly, probably speed up the process of getting a response, and you have that personal relationship, which is always helpful. Doesn't necessarily mean you're going to sign a deal, but again, might be helpful. When to pitch as like the next part. One of the highest priorities here being timing. Timing really is key. Now, this is an example of what a developer production timeline might look like. In this case, for Romanian developed Bear and Breakfast, which this deck is available online. You can find it for like a full deck overview. Dates have been removed, but just imagine some concrete dates here are included. What you will want to look at as a good timeline, or basically figuring out when to pitch someone, is having enough time prior to launch, but also being in a state where you can actually show something off in most cases. The amount of projects that are just signed based on a concept, basically like pre-prototype, is pretty low. What I figured over the last couple of years has become more the trend is anywhere from like pre-production up until pre-launch. Pre-launch, I'd say, depending on your project, is probably a couple of months, and that's typically pretty late, if not too late, for a publisher to jump on board. We tell people that we sign titles at least 6 months out from release because we want to work with them for a longer time. We want to be part of like creating something and have the opportunity to actually come up with a marketing campaign, for example. And all of that, including platform conversations for like a launch support within just a couple of weeks, is probably not doable, in the same way that we as a publisher don't fund anything that doesn't have a prototype already. So pre-production up until like pre-launch is a good phase to consider pitching. and depending on your development timeline, that either may be a couple of months, if not like a year plus that you have available there. Figure out what's best for you when you have the materials that we'll talk about in a second available in a state that you feel comfortable sending them out to a party. From the publisher standpoint, sometimes even if we or anyone else out there gets a phenomenal pitch that we'd like to sign, we don't always have the opportunity because of our scheduling. Now, if you take a look at Devolver and the amount of titles that they put out in 2019, their producers have a pretty focused timeline in mind. They are probably micromanaging and figuring out exactly what's being released when, from the marketing perspective, from a business development perspective, what kind of projects they're pitching to platform holders, and especially considering their community that they have already. Releasing a new game every couple of days or releasing their entire portfolio within a couple of weeks or just a single quarter of the year will not work. So once a publisher has really narrowed down what projects they're working on in like Q3 2021 and have maybe an October release, chances are, at least in like our smaller range of publishing, we're not going to sign a second title that's releasing in Q3 or specifically in October, which I believe is Q4. So ignore that little mistake. Scheduling is everything. As mentioned, making games takes time, platform conversations and negotiations take time, marketing build-up takes time, community development takes time. All of these different elements need to really particularly be planned out, and an overlap doesn't mean necessarily that it's not possible to work together anymore, but there's only so many resources available and you can't just continue hiring. So yeah, if a publisher has a closed up calendar, probably not too much you can do there. And even if a publisher, apparently by looking at their website, doesn't have like a full release schedule, there's always titles in the background that are not announced. So keep that in mind. Feel free to reach out and ask about capacity, and if a publisher is even interested in titles within a particular time frame. Always depends. Speaking of capacity, at the moment publishers are typically looking at like 2022 titles already. This is an old tweet. Ignore this one. It's just a matter of fact that every once in a while a publisher will probably let people also know about their release schedules. We ourselves are also looking at the earliest, like late 2021 releases at this point, I would say. But yeah, most pitches we're getting are like 2022 all the way through late 2023 releases. So pitching a game for like April of 2020 right now is pretty tricky and maybe already too late for many partners out there. Bottom line, there isn't really a time to pitch. December is the end of the year. People are wrapping up their conversations right now and preparing for the time off, at least in like the Western Hemisphere, where many celebrate Christmas and the New Year. And also don't typically email people when they have a meeting marathon, which is in a normal year, like the March-April window of GDC, and then Gamescom in August. As well as like Tokyo Game Show can be quite active in October. There's many events out there, but I would say for most publishers, these are two very big windows. And then check Twitter. This, again, doesn't really work that well in 2020, but you can see who is at events, oftentimes in their Twitter profile. If they're at an event right now, probably not going to respond to your email, so maybe wait a week and then follow up afterwards. So yeah, conclusion: to be realistic, don't be sad if something doesn't work out. Oftentimes it's due to timing, even if your project is phenomenal. Talk early. There's no problem in reapproaching a publisher later on. Just be transparent when reaching out, why you're reaching out, and if you're maybe not ready to sign but just want to present something to parties already, and give yourself a good buffer and potentially also alternatives. Don't just pitch one publisher with a game that's 4 months out from release and then be surprised if you end up in a tricky situation where you have to do all the work yourself. Even if a partner is on board already, do not underestimate the negotiation process. Even if you figure out you want to work together, coming from a original draft contract all the way through a signed contract can take weeks, if not months. The latest project that we signed took about 2.5 months from the first discussion to a signed contract, and things were moving quite quickly. We were all on board pretty quickly that we wanted to work together, but a contract negotiation just goes through from lawyer to lawyer and then feedback and so on, and can take many iterations. Or there's publishers out there that give you like a take it or leave it contract, viable as well. In many cases, I would argue it's probably not something that you would be interested in, but everyone can make up their mind about that themselves. what to prepare when pitching to publishers. So obviously build in most cases. As I mentioned, many people want to see something playable. Doesn't go for everyone. If you're pitching prior to that, you have your parties out there that also fund projects pre-prototype or pre-build. For us, we will want to see a build eventually before we sign, so it's kind of a mandatory thing on our end as well. And based on like an industry survey that me and Alan Dang from Genwit put together earlier in 2020, we figured that for most publishers it's actually more or less mandatory to have a build. What I can recommend is setting up that Steam build, one, so you have control over it and know who you're sending out keys to. Two, it makes things easier for me as well, because if I'm trying to manage builds and look at builds and revisit them every once in a while, we save them locally for our curation purposes, basically, throughout the time that we're reviewing a project. But even beyond that, it's way easier if I can just jump back on Steam, hit the download button, and have quick access to it. It costs $100 through Steam Direct. If you're looking to sign hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of money, well, if you're looking for a couple $100,000 in funding for your project, then $100 should hopefully be doable. And trust people. Realistically, I've never heard of a case where someone like got a key to review a project and it ended up on G2A. Track your keys for sure. That's a given. But yeah, otherwise you're probably pitching the wrong people if you end up with like a shady person that's sending your keys to someone else. Otherwise, build-wise, if you send a build, a standalone build, no Steam keys or Epic keys or whatever, password protection is useless. Test that the malware detection isn't going off when someone unzips their folder. I know it might not be your fault, but it gives off some really bad vibes. And please, no private FTP service with login access required, where you first have to set up an account. A couple of years back when I was like judging for awards, we had to set up accounts, and then some judges it was pretty obvious to them that the project wasn't going to be nominated because of the quality. So they spent like a couple of minutes and then hop back out. And then a couple of weeks later, that developer sent like a really aggressive email about, hey, you only reviewed for 5 minutes. How could you even have made up your mind? Both for awards as well as for pitching projects, there is just a case of sometimes it's easy to tell, and it's not a personal thing. It doesn't really matter if a build isn't really for someone, and then someone else within the team that has like a similar taste or is interested in that kind of genre will probably try out your game. But this whole like private FTP, being secretive kind of thing approach just doesn't help. Video-wise, if you have gameplay footage, perfect, that's preferred. 90% of the publishers that we talked to said they would preferably just get gameplay footage or gameplay footage first. Trailers are fine, gameplay with commentary is fine, animations are fine, but at the end of the day, I want to know how the game feels, how it plays. So like a link to an unlisted YouTube video is probably the best. 5 to 10 minutes of gameplay footage, perfect. And then the deck, which we'll get to in a second. What not to send or what not to send initially. Game design document, really don't care in the beginning. I don't want to read through 45 pages of a game design document or like lore deep dive. That comes next. If I'm hooked by the initial pitch, I want to learn more and I'll ask for that material, or you can follow up with that material. But initially, I want to be able to review your project in like 30 minutes or an hour max and not go through like 3 hours worth of material. As mentioned, lore, like a deep dive, narrative deep dive, same here. And a full on like budget Excel sheet, great to have. I will ask for that eventually, further throughout the process. But like in the very beginning, a budget deep dive is not as necessary as like having just some concrete numbers of this is how much funding I need. But yeah, as I mentioned, all of that will come eventually will come in handy quite heavily later on. So if you prepare that already, perfect. Just don't oversaturate your initial outreach email with material. Now the pitch deck, we'll get through that in a couple of minutes. I just really want to focus on this because I think it's crucial in really summarizing your message and delivering it to the party that you're pitching. Number one is like an opening slide, pretty straightforward. We'll just be going through like the pitch deck very briefly here. An opening slide should be like a book cover. You want the title there, maybe the author, in this case the company, some keywords that might be intriguing, and some shiny key art. Can be some actual screenshots from the game itself, whatever you want to use there, but typically speaking, if you want to make use of your beautiful key art, then just stick to it for like the opening slide and the ending slide. Afterwards, you'll probably follow that up by a catchy introduction slide in form of like a project overview. I want to know immediately what kind of genre you're pitching, or the core elements of the game basically, and you can include like some short insight into the story, the backstory overall, or the setting of the game. Visuals can be quite nice, like having a very sturdy or very persistent graphical style throughout your deck will come in handy because it also delivers a certain vibe. In this case for Backbone, they put out their slides as well on Twitter, which I can happily link everyone to a couple of months ago to give everyone like a good idea of what they pitched with. And their slides, I think, are a very good example of how to do things right. The only constructive feedback I'd have for this particular introduction slide is probably a little bit too much text. Might want to just use some bullet points or split up the slides into multiple decks. This is from like an internal deck that we have for one of our games, Move or Die. Having an elevator pitch or a very brief summary of your project itself at the very beginning of your slides is super handy. I would consider using that same elevator pitch for your initial outreach email as well, because people want to have a good understanding of what you're pitching them immediately to hook them. Don't necessarily go with X meets Y, like Zelda meets Diablo might sound enticing, but you're basically just using other games to describe your game. Rather go with something creative that might not be as telling about your project, but that will hook me immediately. One of my favorite examples being What the Golf, which is basically a golf game for people that hate golf. Doesn't tell me shit about the project, but I immediately am intrigued. Same goes for Superhot, which is a first-person shooter where time only moves when you move. You have somewhat of an idea of how that may work, but not really. But it sounds interesting, no matter if you're into first-person shooters or not. You want to at least learn more about it. And that's, I think, a way better take than, hey, this is a party game, a Zelda meets Ultimate Chicken Horse, or, of course, what's most popular right now, it's like Among Us, but that's not a good pitch. That's not a good elevator pitch. That's what every other pitch looks like these days. And then to jump back to Backbone, design, as I mentioned, is key. This delivers a good indicator of being like an adventure, a more secretive point-and-click type of experience, just by looking at the style overall and at the screenshot that they use as preview image to the YouTube video. And the feedback we'd already discussed about this being a little bit too much text. Features. This can take many different ways. For Backbone, they focused on like 5 core features that they had identified for the project itself. I would argue, looking at their Twitter account, which is wildly successful, I think they have like 13,000 or more Twitter followers. Let's phrase it that way. That works. And a lot of the tweets are about Howard, their raccoon character. It's a game about anthropomorphic animals, something that clearly stands out. They've been to furry conventions in the past. There's definitely an audience there. And that's really a unique selling point that they really have nailed down, both in the game or in the prologue that they've released so far, as well as on their Twitter account. So they would want to highlight that. The Pacific Northwest, typically, at least in recent years, has been an interesting setting. I believe Life is Strange is based out of the Pacific Northwest. So is Oxenfree. And then now here with Backbone, which is based out of an anthropomorphic version of Vancouver. That's another USP that might be quite interesting, as well as their really complex branching narrative structure that I have, especially for a 2D adventure game. So all these different elements may be something that they want to highlight rather than a interesting story, which is not a USP. That's literally how every single person would describe their game, hopefully, if they're confident in it. A different take here, very minimalist. Very minimalist in comparison is this like core gameplay loop structure slide that Wavebreak has put together. This is honestly one of my favorite slides ever I've seen. It really breaks down with 3 core elements what the game is about and directs the attention or your attention to what they want you to look at first. You look at the GIFs, you immediately get an understanding of how the game feels, what it looks like, what it's made out of, the core gameplay loop basically. You look at the yellow headline to get some more context. If something shouldn't be clear, like in the first GIF, if you don't understand that it's about dynamic water, now you do. And then some additional text underneath just to underline what you're looking at here, and maybe some additional information that might have not gotten entirely clear, like the online and local multiplayer gameplay for the multiplayer part of the slide. Fantastic slide. I think one of the best ways of delivering how a game feels. Might not always work for your game, depending on how many different core elements it has, but it can be a really nice way of catching someone's attention, not only for the publisher that you're pitching to, but press as well, or even the end consumer, because keep in mind, all those GIFs are perfect for social media as well. To wrap things up, just to underline, please don't send over a game design document, a GDD, from the get-go as your pitch deck, but really consider what a pitch deck look like, a really good pitch deck might look like, what kind of content you want to include, and scrap about 90% of what you originally had imagined to put into there. You don't want to send over a 30 slide pitch deck. Ideally 10 to 15 slides is perfectly fine. Now, the convincement part, which is part of the pitch deck, but also will be part of your negotiation process later on. Convincement is an actual word. I looked it up. Unlike children, publishers are not willing to imagine the best case scenario for your project, which is a quote by, as mentioned, a trusted industry colleague. It's a very good quote that I think is pretty fair and sort of underlines what kind of situation we as publishers are in as well. As publishers, you typically sign anywhere from, let's say, 0.1% of projects that you get pitched every year up to maybe 2%. Depending, of course, on how many projects you review, but it's a very small percentage, and we have to be critical in the same way, or skeptic, basically, in the same way that you should be skeptical of publishers approaching you without too much context, or without them being as transparent as you may want them to be. We have to be very careful in what we sign, because everything is an investment, in the same way that you have to be careful in what kind of project visions you have come up with internally you want to invest your time into. And there's 3 steps of convincing the other party, a publisher in most cases, of your project being the right fit for them. Just take a quick sip. Number 1, your game should be made and will have an audience. Number 2, you can pull off what you're promising within the budget and the timeline that you're proposing. And number 3, the project that you're pitching can be made by you. Ideally only made by you, but that's a little bit tricky to prove, so let's focus on project is you're able of executing this project. Keep in mind, you have to have a balance of confidence to really bring across your vision, as well as some realism. What I'm trying to say is, if I'm asking you a question about, hey, how do I know that you can pull off what you're promising here? How do I know you will be able to create a multiplayer game? Because I don't see track record of multiplayer skills basically in your portfolio. Then what I don't want to hear specifically is, trust us, we know how to do this or how to execute this. Pretty clearly, that doesn't give me any type of trust. That just tells me that you either don't care enough to explain to me how you'll be able to execute, or you don't know yourself. In the same way that if you're asking me how I'm going to market your game, you don't want to hear, trust me, I know how to do this. You will want to hear some more concrete feedback on that question. Speaking of marketing, the easiest way of convincing someone that a game should be made is having data available. This is a backbone example again. When they were originally pitching, again, this is being a slide off of Twitter, they had these numbers to prove that there was interest in their game, both proven by the wishlist numbers, the interest of people to actually back the game on Kickstarter already that they had run, and an active community on social media. 3 very great points to make. Now, you don't necessarily have to run a social media campaign quite yet, or a Kickstarter campaign. This is a project just from early September. I was doing a workshop and they were part of that. I had nothing to do with this tweet or anything that they've executed since, but I just discovered this a couple of weeks earlier, where Hinterberg, I think is the work in progress title, was posting on Twitter for the first time. And this is either their first or second tweet that they put out, with almost 1,000 retweets and almost 7,000 likes on Twitter. That is something that me as a publisher, or I as a publisher, will find interesting, that I will want to see in a pitch deck. Now, that doesn't mean you will have to have something like that to back up interest in your game, but I think it's a good argument to why more people are going public with their projects these days before they actually have a publisher, rather than afterwards and waiting out for that. Visibility and already having some form of established audience can be a huge selling point to publishers or even platform holders, meaning that if you sign a deal with them, you may not even need a publisher, as myself. If you don't have a project that's public quite yet, you can also do a market analysis. This is a pretty good example of like unsimulators, bunch of titles that a like industry friend of mine put together when pitching. Super helpful for your own orientation in the market if you're trying to figure out what kind of design decisions to factor in when creating your game, if you want to compare your title to other projects out there. But it could be also super helpful in painting a picture of expectations. Now, if I see this slide, then my expectations, or my understanding of the developer's expectations are, this is our market analysis, that's what we're putting ourselves into, to some degree at least, or comparing ourselves to. Meaning that if the game ends up selling 30,000 copies, they may be quite disappointed. And that's my biggest point of criticism with this slide. The lowest number that I can see here is 500,000 units minimum, up until 5 million, I believe, with Goat Simulator. That's not a market analysis. That's an analysis of the top 1% of the market, and will not necessarily be the expectation that the publisher has themselves. If I get a roguelike pitch in 2020 or soon to be 2021, I can almost guarantee you that one, if not multiple of these projects are included, plus like Binding of Isaac or FTL. I appreciate the optimism, and ideally we're going to sign a deal with each other and then our game is going to end up selling 2 million units. Realistically speaking, probably not going to happen, at least not with every project that we sign or every game that you develop. This is not what sales expectations or market analysis should look like, because again, this is probably the top 0.1% of the market. If including 3 titles, such as in this particular case, please include something that's more pessimistic, something that's more around like median sales region, and then optimistic for the market that you're approaching. Keep in mind that according to a study by Mike Rose from 2019, an average game on Steam sells about 1,500 units in its first year, not millions. So your sales expectations may need to be, well, lowered if you're looking at a couple million units in its first year. And then similar beneficial to the conversation is the target audience. Again, just figuring out what target audience you have will help you in figuring out certain design decisions potentially, and it will help us see if we have the same expectations for the project. If you're pitching us a visual novel multiplayer dating sim, very LGBTQ plus friendly, for example, and your target audience is the average Call of Duty player, well, there might be some misalignment there. And if we're trying to market a game to a specific target audience and you're focusing on a different target audience when it comes to design decisions, we will be in trouble. So being clear from the get-go and communicating about this will be super important and help both you and us. Budget and timeline is probably the more scary commitment part for most people, which I fully understand. It's not fun, but it's absolutely necessary. If we end up signing a deal, then there will be a contract in place that states you're going to deliver project X by time Y with funding Z. That's how contracts works. There might be some flexibility here and there, but still the contract will have at least a certain time frame and at least a certain funding range within the contract. This is, I think, a very good example because it goes beyond what most pitch decks look like. So you have the budget rather than the funding required only. Oftentimes we only see, hey, we need $160,000, for example, and we have no idea how much money has been put towards the project. Are we funding the entire project? Do you already have government funding that's supporting you? Have you invested some money yourself? That will help you in most cases argue for like a better revenue share if you've already put money towards a project or have secured government funding, as an example. On the timeline side, again, way more helpful than just having we're going to release Q3 2023 this is how far we've come throughout development, and this is how much additional time or how much additional milestones we have until we've concluded our development process. Ideally, the timeline that we'd looked at before by Bear and Breakfast, something like that would be included as well. That's a little bit more broken down, but I think that can also come a little bit later. So as long as you have an idea of how much money you've invested into the project, how much money you need from the publisher that you're pitching, and what your development timeline roughly will look like with a release window, then we're good and you're in a state where you can pitch. Just make sure that you're not making up those numbers, because that can easily backfire. Again, if you have signed a legal contract, then you're mostly bind to those dates and those funding amounts that you've signed a contract for, and you can't just come around the corner and be like, hey, we need to push our project back by 3 months, because that might mean for a publisher that it's overlapping with other projects that they need to be spending time on, or they may not be open to funding those additional 3 months of development, at least not without conversations about it. Yeah, and this is exactly the timeline that I mentioned before. This is something super helpful, especially since it also considers the post-launch support of like additional DLC, long tail, free content. If you're putting together a budget, keep in mind that you very clearly state if the post-launch support content and work is included in the budget, or if that's contingent on the game's success itself. The final part of convincing someone about your project and about your team is the team slide. I think typically what you should be including is maybe some contact information if that's not already in the deck, just to have it somewhere. A team overview, as in, again, this case with Backbone. Really love their slides, as you may have figured out at this point. Previous work of the company can be super helpful. And relevant previous work of team members. Relevant meaning if you've worked on Call of Duty and mentioned that, sure, that tells me you've shipped a game or you've been part of shipping a game, but you were one of a couple thousand people. So I have no idea what your responsibilities were, what you did for the project, if it has any correlation to what you're pitching right now. Now, if you're telling me, hey, I was a narrative lead or just worked on the narrative behind Call of Duty, then I know you have narrative experience. And if you're pitching me a narrative title, there's a track record that I have some reference to. That'll be helpful to me. That's what I mean with relevant previous work. And then potentially, if you want to be a little bit more transparent, positions that are still to be filled. So I have an understanding of how the team may still grow, or maybe can also help out with getting you in contact with the right people. Key collaborators, if noteworthy, such as oftentimes like external folks, such as maybe a backend developer or a musician that typically isn't part of your team full-time, and then accolades or even your company philosophy. Again, if you're looking for someone that's a really close fit for your personal vibe. The ask or hashtag relationship goals, which will tell you a lot about how young I am because I'm using this hashtag. Topics to potentially cover here are funding range or funding available that you need, revenue share that you're open to, or if you already have made up your mind, a specific take it or leave it revenue share. Basically, you may as well communicate that from the very get-go. What kind of promotion that you want to have, definitely from a publisher, as well as porting. Who's handling that? Do you want to handle that internally? Is it expected for the publisher to take care of that? Transmedia partnerships, such as movie, film crossovers, merchandising, for example. Is that something that you want to keep internally and not give away to the publisher or hand over? And then QA, or most importantly, probably for many people, IP ownership. Reason for that being, if you 100% want to keep your IP and you're pitching a publisher that typically signs over IP or wants to have IP signed over to them, then this is a very easy way of cutting the conversation short and not wasting your time and their time. So I think a ask sheet is generally quite helpful. And then finally, a summary sheet. This example particularly is from some template slides that Gwen Foster at Robot Teddy put together. I'll have a link to those at the very end, but I think they're phenomenal and have been quoted a couple of times by industry veterans as being super helpful or just very well-structured slides. So keep an eye out for those if you want an easy template that works quite well in pitching to publishers or pitching to platform holders. Then these might be quite helpful to you as well. And then finally, the key art that I mentioned in the very beginning as like a closing slide. Now, speaking of art, we'll just briefly jump through this. Both static imagery and moving imagery. As you may have figured out, screenshots are typically the best use for your pitch deck. Key art can be nice as an opener and closing slide, but everyone wants to know how the game looks like and how the game will probably feel if you're pitching them the game. So any renders from the game that might not be really reflective of what the game will actually look like, or a mock-up, are not as helpful as actual screenshots. But then again, if you only have mock-ups available, mock-ups are entirely fine. On the moving imagery side, gameplay, well, it shows you how the game plays, so might as well stick to that. Probably the best take. A trailer can maybe underline your capability to create a cool trailer, but it's not going to tell me why your project is good or why I should be involved in your project, in the same way that just an animation may underline your animation skill internally, but not really underline your skill to make the game itself. So gameplay first, everything else maybe as a bonus. And then finally the GIFs. This is a slide without GIFs. This is a slide with GIFs. Very clear that there is a huge benefit to that. If you're sending over a PDF, yeah, that might not be possible, of course, which is why in many cases I really enjoy Google Slides, because it just gives you a little bit more ways of customizing things. You could also send over both if you care, like a PDF as an attachment and a Google Slide as a link. That's also something I've seen quite often in the past. If you want to dive further into the screenshot topic, we don't have that time today, but there's a really good blog post on screenshot theory by Adam and Becca Saltzman over at Finji, another indie publisher. Yeah, I can post a link into the chat afterwards as well, or we'll hopefully add it as well to like the description under the video recording. Writing for comprehension is a good argument, or an argument why you not always need a graphic designer that's looking out to create like a super over the board presentation. This is a very clean presentation that I would argue most people could put together themselves using standard tools in Google Sheets or in PowerPoint. It's obviously some time and energy has been put into this, into making sure that the right messaging comes across, that there's just some keywords, it's not an overload of text, and a very well chosen GIF in here, and then obviously some good use of bolding and italic fonts in here. Pretty straightforward, pretty simple, but very clean, and all without major involvement from a designer on the deck, if you don't have the necessary resources available. That being said, if you do, visual deck design can be a pretty cool factor here, or at least like some nice eye candy when first checking out a pitch deck. Obviously, most people are probably not going to sign your game just because of the pitch deck or the visual design, but it again can be a nice indicator of your overall skill set in preparing something that looks nice and shiny. Now, the final phase, the actual pitching phase, and I think we have about like another 7 minutes. We should just barely make it. I'll hurry up here. Now that the preparation phase is over, you will be looking at pitching someone. You know which publishers to contact, you've decided when to reach out to someone, and ideally you have the materials ready to go. Otherwise, maybe still hold off from the pitching phase. When it comes to reaching out, ideally via email, as I mentioned. Personal goes over generic emails, goes over a mail merger, and that goes over a newsletter. Does everyone know what like a mail merger is? All right, cool. So mail merger, typically how that works, at least the ones that I use, you set up an email template. It's still a pretty generic email at the end of the day because it's not really customized. And then you enter variables basically into the email. So for example, it would be a dear variable. And once you send that email will be sent to everyone from a spreadsheet. And all those variables have then different are basically just columns within that spreadsheet. So a column will be name, a column will be publisher name, and another column will be project name. So if I'm sending an email, hey Adam, I really enjoy what Finji is doing. Your upcoming game Tunic looks great. Then Tunic, Finji, and Adam will be all variables. It's just an easy way of speeding up copy-paste emails basically through the press of a button. What I'm trying to say here is that's maybe not the best way of doing things. One, it can easily be screwed up and suddenly you have the wrong company name in there because that shit happens. We recently received a friendly email to, who was it sent? I think it was addressed to Akupara Games. Great people. It's not us. And I was very surprised when that popped up. But it's pretty clear, like, okay, you spent some time on drafting a generic email and then sent that to everyone. All right, good to know. A newsletter is the absolute worst. If someone pitches me, I've never received a interesting pitch via like a newsletter where people are just grouped together. They added you without any consent. I think that goes against GDPR guidelines. Either way, not fun. And you will want to just focus on the personal outreach. Like if you are looking for a partner to come on board and potentially invest thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars into your project, you can spend a day or two on sending out email pitches. Now, the absolute worst case scenario is this. CCing everyone. I'm baffled when I see this every single time because this shit ends up on Twitter. Like, you know it. We're obviously going to remove whoever sent that email and all personal data. But what the fuck? Not only is it somewhat insulting to our time, like, just imagine I would be declining your pitch by sending a copy-paste email text like, "Dear developer, sorry, we're declining your pitch, blah, 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 bye," and CC like 30 people on it. You'd be fucking annoyed by that shit. In the same way that it's, I don't know, just really out of touch. Also, interestingly enough, it points a very good picture about how little information or how little time the developer put into researching. There's us as thoseawesomeguys.com in here, as well as CD Projekt Red. If you have a project that you're pitching, one, I don't know if CD Projekt Red is publishing. I'm not aware of that yet. Two, if you're pitching CD Projekt Red with a game, we're definitely not the right fit. Same way, the other way around as well. If you're pitching us, CD Projekt Red is definitely not the right fit for you, or you're just super out of touch. So yeah, this is bad. This was intentional. Oftentimes it happens that it's unintentional, where they tried to BCC everyone, but they fucked up and added everyone in CC. And then it's always just like just a matter of waiting for the first person to hit reply all and see what happens. That's always hilarious. That's a lot of fun. You don't have to go through this list. I had it in a different format, but it basically was the how to figure out who to pitch and what publishers are out there kind of approach to figure out which are the right individuals to pitch. If you already have a company, we talked about scouts. Here's a couple of like Twitter profiles of people that do scouting or are involved in like developer relations and such that will keep an eye out for content. Super easy to figure out online. Just spend some time. We'd already gone through that example previously. And this is a really good first contact email, to be quite honest. It's super short. This is, again, taken from Callum's talk at Reboot back in the day. A little too short in my mind, but it starts with an elevator pitch. There's a link to a build. Maybe a little bit more information overall, but at least it's not like pages long worth of email content. I would argue this is probably the perfect email template if you want to take a screenshot or pause the recording here. Again, full credit to Callum that put this together. Really nice overview of all the material that you should probably add into an email at most. And anything beyond that can wait for like personal communication. Here's just a couple of examples here that of good and less great examples. This one, a free-to-play online party game that was pitched to us. We don't do free-to-play. Obviously, this developer didn't spend any time on figuring that out, so that's an easy no for us. This one is alright. Pro, it's short. Con, generic subject. Email, there's no personality, just a trailer link, nothing else whatsoever. Really doesn't strike me as being the most enticing pitch overall, and I'd be surprised generally by receiving such an email if that project ends up being the most promising one to us. As long as it's not the next Dead Cells in our mind, we're probably not going to get on board with this team. Here, another one, personal, short introduction, straight to the point. It's not a super long email. Plus, it continues with some further information underneath that I cut out here. Con, or, pro and cons. Yeah, con, that's VR, which we don't do. Just go to our website, pretty easy. All these examples were pretty short. We have plenty of other emails that point a very different picture. Sometimes we get emails that have 16 attachments, which is I immediately don't want to review your email because it's just going to be a pain figuring out what works, what fits together, what works how. This is ideally what I want to get. A Google Drive link to here's our material. It's easily numbered, maybe has even a version number behind it, or it's very clearly named in a way that I can immediately know what I'm looking at. This is more material that I would need. It could be just a build, it could be the build and pitch deck, but just having a link available with all the material in one place is super nice rather than a bunch of email attachments. Typically, I'd stick to 2 email attachments max. Anything beyond that is just, a little too much. And then finally on that end, redundancy in your introduction email is key. If you're reaching out to someone and sending them an introduction email, keep in mind all that information that's in the introduction email might not make it through to the rest of the team because that scout or that person will take your pitch deck that you send over and maybe the link to your build and send that or pass it along to everyone else within the team through their company Discord, Slack, whatever. But the chance of them just forwarding your email to everyone are probably rather slim, so make sure there is some redundancy between your email and the pitch deck. Now, very briefly, NDAs, typically not really worth it. If you want to sign an NDA, most publishers have like a mutual NDA standard agreement that they're happy to send over and agree and just sign with you. What I found out through like our own little industry survey this year was 30% of publishers don't even sign developer or sign NDAs. They're not open to it. They just want to have a conversation. It's not about them stealing your project. That in all my years that I've been in this industry, or at least talked to people about these kinds of relationships, I've heard about one weird situation where something happened where the developer was quite uncomfortable and was rather certain that the publisher may have taken some of the information out of a pitch and turned that into like a rip-off project. That being said, if that happens, an NDA will probably not save you because there's always an argument to be made like, hey, similar ideas. If it's not a one-to-one rip-off, then it just happens in this industry that people have similar ideas or similar inspirations and they may have started with production earlier than receiving your pitch. An NDA can be helpful, but in most cases, it will just cost you time. And what you shouldn't do is hide all your information behind an NDA. If I receive an email, hey, we want to pitch you something, but not without an NDA, I'm only going to sign this sign it if it's Sony or Microsoft that's reaching out to me, not someone that I've never spoken to before. Because at least the core developer pitch, an elevator pitch, should be something that you're comfortable with sharing. Because an idea is worth nothing without the execution. And you can pitch me whatever you want, but as long as I don't know that you will actually be able to execute it, that idea isn't going to really advance me further or be enticing enough for me to steal it. Because I have crazy enough ideas myself. I'm just bad at game development, so I'm not going to make it myself. Now, what to expect with a typical developer pitch, and these are the last couple of slides. During a pitch, in a either personal, like one-on-one in-person event at GDC or whatever might happen in the next coming years, we don't really know with COVID, as well as online via all these digital business matchmaking opportunities, 5 to 30 minute pitches, 5 being the worst. They exist, unfortunately. 30 minutes, I think, is quite typical, sometimes even up to an hour, depending on which publisher you sit down. Focus on getting through the pitch itself. Ideally have some questions for the publisher. If you have some, then present them during the presentation. It shows that you did your research and know of them and want to learn a little bit more about a potential relationship. And this is just going to be an initial introduction. There's not going to be a deal signed right on the spot, which should hopefully be quite obvious. You can ask for standard terms if they're available, but typically that's also the next step after reviewing the project internally, and then they'll come back to you with like a initial offer or like a time to jump on an additional call. Don't get your hopes up. It's literally publishers' jobs to have meetings. It's this weird situation where sometimes people prefer to be turned down immediately if a publisher has a very strong feeling it's not going to be a right fit, to not waste the developer's time. Sometimes people are super pissed because obviously the argument oftentimes is publishers are unapproachable, it's hard to get in contact with them, you don't get chance to pitch them their vision. So we also have to sort of manage that and figure out the best case. Do you want to jump on a 30-minute call, even though I already know we're not going to say no to your, not going to say yes to your project? Is that wasting your time? Will you appreciate it because there's time for feedback, or just time for like a general introduction round for maybe the next project? Either way, there's not always going to be a meeting and not always going to be a follow-up meeting, even if you may want to. In the same way that us publishers sometimes want to engage in a conversation with developers and they shut us down immediately because they're not interested in a publisher, which is fine. And this is the first of many steps. So you will exchange an email probably, or contact details, and then follow up. This is going to take a long time, as we established further. And you can always request to pass along more material afterwards, or to be passed along some material by the publisher. Further review internally will most likely happen if the project is something that the publisher is interested in. After that initial conversation, what to expect? Well, lots of nothing. Publishers unfortunately can be dicks sometimes about getting back to you. I've spotted myself sometimes taking way too much time, because at the end of the day, I'm looking at projects, but we don't have a full-time scout, so the priority for me is the project that we already have signed, where I have a commitment to them, where I need to make sure they're successful and need to make sure that they are delivered on time. So if I have to decide between our already signed project and getting back to projects that we're in conversation with, it will unfortunately land on supporting developers that we have financial and contractual obligations to, as much as I may hate it. 95% plus declined, most of the times even more often than that. We all wish we could sign more projects. It's nothing personal, but it comes down to money, resources, time available, well, basically all grouped together into resources, and there's only so much time at the end of the day. And then a minimum of 2 months from contact to contract, or from conversation to contract. Anything short of that would be surprising to me, or would probably come hand in hand with a take it or leave it kind of deal, where there's not a lot of negotiation. And as I hopefully made clear more often than once, legal clauses can be quite complicated. Make sure to have a lawyer lined up. It is a business transaction at the end of the day. Even if I'm signing a game by a friend of mine, they will sign a contract, I will sign a contract, I will have a lawyer on board. They are expected, at least I would assume they would have a lawyer on board to their benefit. And if you're following up on a conversation, then typically like after 2 or 3 weeks is perfectly fine. Within 3 days, not a lot is usually going to happen. Just come with the necessary patience, as you would expect from a publisher as well. Following up. So, doing a pitch, ask when to follow up. If you want to follow up afterwards, or if you just want to wait for to hear back, then that's perfectly fine. Stay friendly, stay professional, as should a publisher. If they don't, then fuck them. They're probably not the right partner for you from the get-go. And make sure that you're not burning bridges. At the end of the day, it's a small industry. If someone is treating you unfairly, sure, burning bridges is fine, but it's still a way of being the better person, basically, and staying true to your values and to your professionalism. Now, next up, ideally, is the negotiation process. What typically happens is what I call rinse and repeat, back and forth and back and forth. The scout will check out your project. They will bring it to the next entity within the company. They will check out the project. Then there's maybe a team review. Then maybe the CEO will have to sign off on the project. And at that point, finally, you will be able to actually start a negotiation process. What happens most of the time, unfortunately, is a rejection. The reality is most of the conversations end here, and it's perfectly natural. It's disappointing. Don't take it personal. Devs oftentimes reject us publishers as well, which hurts. But that's part of the business. And ideally, if you stay on good terms, at some point you'll be able to enter into a relationship that works out for everyone, and ends up being a positive experience, and you make those hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars. Final closing gift that I really enjoy, and here's some additional material that I can really recommend in case you want to dive further into that topic. And if you want to stay in touch, these are my contact details. The more material link that I have here goes towards the backbone and the Bear and Breakfast pitch deck in case you're interested. But if you need any other material, hit me up on Twitter or email. Thank you very much.